Dear Dr. Clark, I'm hoping you can help me with a quick question about historical theology. I'm sure you're busy, don't mean to take away from your work, etc., etc. I'd like to get your opinion on a claim I'm seeing made regarding justification by faith alone, and perhaps you can provide some direction in terms of further resources. The claim is that Pelagius, the British monk known for teaching a form of works righteousness, in fact taught the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. No, I can help you right there, Pete. That's nonsense. It's not true, and I can tell you where to look. He goes on to say, due to an explicit expression using this phrase, justified by faith alone, yes, he does, but you have to read it in context in his biblical commentaries. It seems to me more reasonable to think that he was simply using terms, but means something substantially different by the terms than what the magisterial reformers meant. You would be right. That is correct, P. You're perfectly right about that. And what their successors meant by them. I'm hoping you can shed some light. Sincerely in Christ. So this is from PR. PR, you are exactly right. Your instincts are right. And I can tell you where to go. There's an English translation. I don't remember when it came out, maybe 10, 15 years ago, published by Oxford University Press. English translation. It's a very thin little commentary by Pelagius on Romans. And you can see for yourself exactly what Pelagius says. When Pelagius says faith, he means works. He doesn't mean resting, receiving, trusting in the finished work of Christ. He doesn't understand sola gratia. It's more like sola natura. He has a different definition of grace, and he certainly doesn't have any notion of the righteousness of Christ being imputed to us. So anybody trying to tell you that Pelagius anticipated the Reformation is trying to pull the wool over your eyes and evidently can't read a text very well, because Pelagius is rather plain in what he intended to say. He wasn't embarrassed by it. He wasn't trying to necessarily to fool anyone. He thought that he was right, and he says fairly plainly what he intended to say in terms of his doctrine of salvation in his commentary on Romans.
From St. Jerome. I'm sorry this is not available online. This is, as far as I know, still untranslated from the Latin, so I've provided you here with the Latin translation of Jerome. But he says, for being ignorant of the justice of God, that is, righteousness of God, and seeking to establish their own, the Jews, they have not submitted themselves to the justice of God, not knowing that God justifies by faith alone, sola fide, in the Latin, literally, sola fide, and thinking that they are just by the works of the law, which they did not observe, they would not submit themselves to the remission of sins, lest they should appear to have been sinners. So they wouldn't admit that they were sinners so that they might be justified by faith alone. They wouldn't submit themselves to that, and for that reason sought to be justified by their works of the law, which they did not even observe. But again, St. Jerome refers to it as being justified.
Seminary-trained ordained minister Calvinist apologist Anthony Rogers apparently thinks that the mere presence of sola fide language in St. Jerome constitutes proof that he taught the confessional Protestant doctrine of sola fide. He does so to support the idea that the Protestant Reformation was not making up new doctrines, that Protestant sola fide is directly rooted in the patristic corpus, and it was the Church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, and by extension the Orthodox Church, that deviated. In other words, the Protestant Reformation, with its peculiar understanding of sola fide, was meant to be a return back to what the early church supposedly actually taught before it deviated. But what seminary-trained ordained minister Calvinist apologist Anthony Rogers didn't realize when quoting St. Jerome is that those words do not actually belong to him, rather being misattributed to him. They are, in fact, the words of Pelagius. Let's compare what seminary-trained ordained minister Calvinist apologist Anthony Rogers quoted, supposedly being from St. Jerome, with what Pelagius wrote. This is what Pelagius wrote, quote, "For they, not knowing the justice of God and seeking to establish their own justice, have not submitted themselves to the justice of God, not knowing that God justifies by
faith alone, sola fide, in the Latin, literally, sola fide,
and thinking that they were just on the basis of works of the law, which they did not keep, they refuse to submit themselves to the forgiveness of sins, lest they should seem to have been sinners. The two commentaries are essentially identical. So seminary-trained ordained minister Calvinist apologist Anthony Rogers literally used Pelagius, the antithesis to Calvin and every other position that adheres to the idea that salvation is gratuitous or by grace, to supposedly prove the confessional Protestant doctrine of sola fide in the Church Fathers.
Faith alone. Sola fide. In the Latin, literally, sola fide.
Read it in context, 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 read it in context.
Faith alone. Sola fide. In the Latin, literally, sola fide.
So anybody trying to tell you that Pelagius anticipated the Reformation is trying to pull the wool over your eyes and evidently can't read a text very well, 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 can't read a text very well.